I'm Ryan Androsov. Welcome to Let's Think Digital. People don't usually think that governments are particularly agile or innovative. Let's face it, when most folks think of bureaucracy, they think about lifers punching a clock, resistant to change, and happy with routine. In the political realm, one of the easiest ways to score points is to dump on public servants. But I think that's unfair. When I was working in the federal government here in Canada, helping to set up what became the Canadian Digital Service, I came across so many people working in government who wanted nothing more than to shake up the status quo and to innovate in order to be able to serve their fellow citizens better. For these passionate professionals, their eyes were wide open to some of the downsides of the big bureaucratic machine, but they knew at their core that government has to be there to solve the big challenges of today and tomorrow. Of course, the desire to change things is one thing, knowing how to put that desire into action is another. So on this episode, we want to tackle the question, is innovation something that can be taught? And is this a skill set that public servants need to learn? Our guest this week certainly thinks so. Robyn Scott is the CEO and founder of Apolitical, a global learning platform dedicated to supporting public servants in building 21st century governments that work for people and the planet. Apolitical has tens of thousands of members from around the world learning, sharing, and building connections. And Robyn has a lot to say about what she's been seeing in her time running this platform. Have a listen. Robyn is the co-founder and CEO of Apolitical, an organization based out of the UK, but with global reach, doing some really interesting work in the space around building public sector capacity for the digital era and to deal with modern challenges. Robyn, really glad you could come join us today, even though I know you're battling a bit of a head cold. So thank you for fighting through that to come join for the conversation. Would love to have you just introduce yourself a bit and tell us a little bit about Apolitical and what you do.
Fantastic. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, even with the cold. My voice sounds strange at the best of times, being a product of the UK, New Zealand, and Botswana. And now I've got the gravel and notes of a cold added to it. But great pleasure to be here. I'm, as you say, co-founder and CEO of Apolitical. Our mission at Apolitical is to build 21st century governments that work for people and the planet. So digital and data are threads that run deeply through that. And we are a network and learning platform for the public sector, the whole government stack. So local government right through to multilateral, because we believe that actually some of the biggest opportunities are by building connective tissue between the layers of government. And right now, we are used by about 200,000 public servants and policymakers in 160 different countries to find and share best practice and to upskill themselves on 21st century challenges with short online courses.
Wow, no, it's impressive. And Robyn, Apolitical has been around since around 2015, right? And I think it's quite impressive the growth you've kind of seen since that time. You mentioned that Apolitical is a learning platform, right? I mean, at its core, Apolitical is trying to kind of spark learning. What are the types of kind of skill sets and areas that you're seeing there's the most demand for amongst public servants?
Yeah, so as you say, we took our first baby steps back in 2015, really just an idea, then launched a platform in 2017 and have been building since. And it's been a really exciting time to build an organization like Apolitical doing what we're doing, because the context in government has shifted so much. When we started, the questions we got, the absurd, naive questions from outside of government was like, are there any innovators in government who would want to share best practice? Government isn't interested in learning some of the classic sort of put downs of government. And since then, we've obviously gone through these enormous shifts, technological shifts, geopolitical shifts, and governments are hungrier than ever to learn and adopt new ways of working. And the world writ large has kind of woken up to the fact that governments are critical to the rest of society running effectively. Witness COVID, witness the debate now about the regulation of AI, etc. So that's been the time we've spanned, which has been very interesting. In terms of themes, so as I said, we have this ambition to build 21st century governments, and the way we focus our work to enable that is around 4 pillars, which we consider to be the 4 critical pillars of effective 21st century governments. Those are digital and data, climate and sustainability, equity, equality, and inclusion. And the 4th one is a bit of a catch-all, but we call it just 21st century government, which includes things like human-centered design, citizen engagement, agile governance, leadership, etc., the tools of a modern public servant. And those 4 pillars are really interesting because you should be incorporating the thinking that relates to them in almost anything you're doing in governments today. If you think about any big policy initiative, it's probably got digital and data, it's probably got a climate and sustainability angle, it's probably got equity, equality, and inclusion, and it probably relies on some agile ways of working, etc. So those really are mainstreamed across any training we're developing on the platform. They tend to be where our conversations from our community aggregate around. We see so much interest across those topics. Of course, there's plenty more that we cover, but those really form the pillars.
Yeah. Well, and that, as you say, that intersectionality between those different pillars, I think is an interesting part of that story, right? Because, historically, in my experience too, back when I was in government, and now that I see it outside doing, some similar capacity building work to the work that you do at Apolitical, we tended to think about those domains sometimes as being off in their own silos. And I think, to your point, I mean, the complexity of modern policy challenges really requires public servants to stretch themselves beyond some of those traditional boundaries.
100%. And back to the problem space that we got excited about when we founded Apolitical. I founded it with a former US public servant, Lisa Witter. It was the fact that you've got one of the world's most significant workforces, certainly one of its most powerful and one of its largest, left behind by tech and product innovation and working in silos. So silos, certainly silos between countries, but huge silos within government itself, sometimes within departments. And that comes at an enormous cost. McKinsey actually put a figure on it in 2017 and worked out that if governments just did what was already working elsewhere, so this is nothing new, this is status quo best practice, it would unlock $3.5 trillion a year of savings for society. And that's what galvanizes us. Like, how do we use network intelligence of this global public sector community to unlock that incredible value? And a lot of that is about intersectionality and thinking in terms of win-wins, multiple dimensions of policymaking. Some of it is structural, right? Some of it is to do with misaligned incentives between departments that we can't have direct leverage over fixing. But a lot of it is just about connecting people to each other more swiftly, more organically. There's so much tacit knowledge in government. There's so much movement in government between departments that finding a way to keep people connected and stop the loss of institutional knowledge is really critical.
Yeah, I mean, that connective tissue and that kind of networked effect in government it's incredibly powerful. But as you said, I find the reality is, a lot of public servants, particularly those who are in kind of transformation roles, tend to frankly just not have that many free hours in the day. It's tough to kind of make that part of the practice. And I will say it's something that I appreciate about the approach Apolitical has taken. Even myself, I've benefited from using the platform and connecting with public servants around the world who I wouldn't have had, an easy opportunity to meet otherwise. And are you finding that's become a big use case for the platform? I mean, obviously you have courses and learning you offer, but are you seeing the public servants are actually using it for kind of a more informal networking and best practice sharing approach?
100%. And we also design that informal networking and best practice sharing into our courses. So all our learning is social, because learning is so much better if it's about more than just the content, but it's about the experience, it's about the community you build while you're going through a course, because that's where you make the jump to culture change and workforce transformation, right? So we think about learning in quite an expansive way, and we wire social through everything we do. So on our courses, they infuse by case studies and user testing from our community. You're learning from your peers, and then you're learning alongside your peers. You're doing lots of practical exercises. And it was interesting. We ran a series of courses for an agency in Canada, which was quite distributed. And one of the biggest takeaways they had was the social and community benefits of having a shared learning experience that brought together people from disparate parts of the department and helped them identify ways they could collaborate better. So that's kind of how social infuses the more formal side of learning, but 100% on the informal side, the kind of organic collisions. What we're seeing a lot around, we run a lot of events for our community, and there's a lot of connection on those live events and discussion. We always structure them so that what the speakers are saying is no less important than what's been said on the chat. But we've recently released a new Q&A feature, and we built that because there's this demand in government to often get really quick, specific answers to questions, because public servants are so busy, and because you've got this paradox where government kind of works slowly from the outside, but anyone who's been on the inside knows that a lot of stuff actually happens at quite short notice, and answers are needed in a week's time or a few days' time. So with this feature, we wanted to say, okay, how can we quickly get an answer out to the community, get a question out to the community, get an answer back in like a day or two max. But off the back of questions and answers, we're seeing people connecting, and a huge appetite to do more of that. It's a really difficult challenge because profiles, and you will know this, anyone listening who's in government will know this, the profiles of people don't necessarily tell you who you need to speak to. Right. It is not as simple as saying, okay, that's the buyer. Everyone knows that they're the power brokers, they're the nodal people, they're the people who've worked on projects that aren't visible at the profile level. So we're thinking a lot about how we can use people's answers to questions to help direct and nudge people together. We're doing some really exciting work in the company right now, looking at how we can leverage GPT-4 and equivalents to help us summarize ideas more easily, so synthesize insights from the community, because the time pressures are so great, and also help with those insights that could help us connect people better. So it's absolutely critical to get right. It's absolutely critical at that to unlock that 3.5 trillion, but it's a hard problem. And I think we've done some really great work. We see great connections, but we are at the foothills of where that can go. The one thing I'd say, just to add to that, is there's an interesting relationship where you are probably most likely most of the time to get most value from better connections in your own government or from analogous governments. And you get a lot of sharing as a result between, for example, Commonwealth countries. So we are headquartered in the UK, but Canada, in fact, is our largest user base in the world. So we have tens of thousands of Canadian public servants and huge engagement in Canada. And then we have obviously a lot in the UK, a lot in Canada, a lot in Australia and New Zealand, so countries that have similar systems. And it's great to foster sharing between them. And we're building on a lot of sharing protocols and practices and cultures that already exist. But you also want to engineer those more left field connections with countries that aren't like you, because whilst for the majority of the time they might not be relevant, that's also where you get the completely killer insights, the ones that help reframe thinking about something. And digital is a fantastic example of that, because if you take wealthy countries and poor and middle income countries, which tend to not be comparable often on a policy basis, in some respects, those low and middle income countries are also some of the greatest leaders on digital. And I think we need to see more humility in wealthy countries looking further afield for insights. I mean, India's an obvious one with Aadhaar, and there are numerous others.
Well, and we often kind of see that there's this advantage actually in countries, if you want to frame it that they're kind of coming to digital a bit later, is they don't have all the legacy around legacy technology, legacy policies, legacy processes. And I think you're absolutely right. They have that ability to almost kind of look at things with a bit of a clean slate and be able to leapfrog in some cases on that. Well, and it kind of gets to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because you've got this kind of unique global learning platform. You've obviously seen people from as you mentioned 100 plus 160 countries around the world who've interacted. I mean, do you have a sense that there are some universal lessons, amongst those four pillars that kind of apply everywhere? Or to what degree is kind of effective learning in this space or effective skills development context specific? Because this is even within Canada, we face this question sometimes, or sometimes people say, the federal government is so unique from the provincial government, so unique from municipal government. And I'm torn on that, right? Because obviously, like, context matters, but I do wonder if sometimes everybody kind of thinks their context is special, and there may actually be some universal, skills and approaches that could be applicable anywhere.
Yeah, I think the answers are yes and yes. Yes, they're universal approaches, and yes, there's context specific. And one of the things we grapple with a lot is how do we navigate that, and how do we help people share the stuff that's most universally applicable, and then foster the context specific stuff more through community sharing and exchange of tacit knowledge, etc., because they are different ball games. I think first at a principle level, we are seeing more universal approaches stemming from more work being done around digital and data, especially in government, because those principles are often more fungible, right? They just digital translates more than other things often translate. Once you've got, digital infrastructure is that much more flexible than other policy infrastructure. Right. So I think there's a trend towards more universal principles. If you then, or transferable knowledge, if you then look at what else is shared, it's certainly true that, learning tends to sit at this has tended to be looked at in isolation of culture, and it cannot be. The extent to which learning sticks and is able to be applied is incredibly culture dependent. So you can look at your infrastructure in terms of your policy infrastructure. If you're looking at how able you are to apply digital innovations, you might look at your pre-existing digital infrastructure, which can be a legacy drag, but it can also be an enabler. But if you don't look at your cultural infrastructure, you are going to be really a bit hamstrung and constrained. Yep. So that's really important, and that is the same, right? There are certain principles around culture, like willingness to share, collaboration, value of learning that's held high in the organization, where you've got real leadership from the top, and you need that everywhere. Then I think some of the things that are clearly more context specific. Scale matters a lot, right? We've seen how small countries are able to often launch innovations incredibly effectively and swiftly. Yep. Just look at New Zealand, the Nordics. There are plenty of examples of these like high functioning, agile countries, which are partly it's a product of being well-run governments in many cases, but it's also just scale. And then you look at what's needed at the scale of a country like India or Brazil. It's just a different ball game. So that is kind of an obvious one. When you're looking at digital, we're doing a lot of digital programs. We're looking a lot at what works in wealthier countries versus emerging countries, and definitely your starting infrastructure is is a really can be a critical impediment. One other thing, I think, the inherent risk aversion in a country back to culture makes a big difference around what sticks and what doesn't. I don't want to point fingers because we sort of in the business more, we try to focus on celebrating what's working in government, but there are definitely some countries, if you look at, say, digital as an example, who talk a lot about wanting to change, but just can't get themselves over the initial hurdles and the risks and the changes that are required.
Well, no, I mean, listen, I'm happy to point some fingers and say I think this is one of the challenges we have in Canada, right? I mean, I think we do in the public service here, certainly from my experience, right? And I've seen there is that risk adverse culture in some ways. I might, in the Canadian context, I might call it a bit of a kind of paralysis by consensus culture, where we tend to be very conciliatory. We want to get everybody's input into things, but it makes it very difficult, particularly in kind of a federated government like we have with federal powers, provincial powers, and municipal governments playing a pretty big role in some areas. It's actually very, very difficult to bring everybody along at the same time. And I do find that I think that kind of in our context here in Canada tends to actually slow things down quite a bit.
Yeah, I find the Canadian example completely fascinating because on the one hand, at the level of the individual public servant, witness the hugely high adoption we've had on Apolitical, even though we don't have a physical office there, for example. Right. There's so much appetite, there's openness. Our Canadian members are some of the most enthusiastic. They share frequently, they show up to stuff, but then they also complain disproportionately about how their government's not doing enough on digital. So there seems to be appetite at the individual level, but maybe it's something structural holding the government back writ large from making big changes, and perhaps that's inherent in the federated model.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, obviously underpinning a lot of the work that you're doing is around teaching public servants how to be innovative, how to sometimes be disruptive, in these systems. And certainly from that cultural aspect, if you think about the culture of the public servant, I can speak to the Canadian context with some confidence, but I think this is generally true in a lot of places around the world. Governments tend to value stability, right? And sometimes the types of personalities that get attracted into government, will value stability. And even with kind of that Canadian slant on it, we always think about, the U.S. Constitution talks about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Canadian equivalent is peace, order, and good government, which right there kind of, shows the distinction. And so I wonder from your experience, I mean, can you teach public servants how to be disruptive, how to be innovative, particularly when they may be in a culture, within their organization that actually values stability more than those traits?
Yeah. So short answer is yes. The more nuanced answer is I think the culture tends to be more of a constraint than the people. So it is true that government's hiring processes and reputation might attract a slightly less risk-averse crowd than your average group going into tech, certainly. But what we tend to see is public servants tend to be ahead of their governments when it comes to risk. And I'll give two data points around that. The first is sort of on innovation in general, and we got it in the early months of COVID when we surveyed our membership on what was worrying them most as they contended with this unprecedented crisis. And at the top of the list, number one, and no surprises here, was how do you protect vulnerable citizens, people during COVID. But second on the list, and this did surprise us, was how do we preserve the innovations that have been forced through as a result of COVID? So there is real, and I think part of the issue with disruption is we see it as binary. We either slow or super disruptive. It's not like that. There's a whole spectrum. And I think there's a massive amount of appetite towards the middle of the spectrum from individuals in the public service to do things faster and better. And then just the other survey we ran, which was really illuminating on this, was asking public servants about climate, and the appetite for individual public servants to do more on climate than their departments were doing. And this was people in core climate roles and in
Hmm.
adjacent roles was huge. It was way, I don't have the exact figure to hand, but it was like staggeringly high. So here you have again the individuals saying, we want this, come on governments, get with the picture. So you certainly can. And I think the way to do it, so you've got that sort of underlying appetite, you have to unlock senior support, that really matters. You have to shift the culture along with the skills. So when you're teaching something like digital, you have to think of all the adjacencies, right? How more agile ways of working. And I know this is, I'm talking to one of the experts on this, but it's non-obvious to many people. But that the sort of soft surrounding enabling environment of digital and digital ways of working are absolutely critical. And then there also, there are a whole bunch of tactics that allow for more flexibility with lots of safeguards, witness regulatory sandboxes, for example, small projects with containment. There's always a risk of pilotitis, one of the serious government diseases, but for the most part, they're ways of mitigating the impact and the risk. And I also think risk is talked about in the wrong way in the public sector often, because think about the risk involved in these huge overruns of projects that are done in the most conservative way, where you procure over a 2-year period, and by the time
Hmm.
you've procured something, the technology is out of date. That has its own
Yep.
risk. It's not a risk for which people get fired, but it's definitely a risk. And I think there's more and more of a realization of some of those kind of hypocritical oversights in the public sector.
Yeah, it's I often kind of describe it as it's not that the government doesn't take risk; it takes huge risks that often don't pan out, but it distributes the risk so that no one individual person is accountable for it, which I think is part of why it gets to perpetrate and kind of move on. And Robyn, I'm interested to pick up on something that you were just talking about, because obviously this area around how do we move our organizations and transform them is core to the work that I do and the things that I care about a lot, and have seen this kind of both from the inside and outside. I often think a lot about structures and incentives within our organizations and how those either constrain or enable us. And I like this term you used of pilotitis, because I see this often, right, where government's actually pretty good at being able to do pilot projects, but it's not very good at being able to scale those pilots, right? When something works, when an innovation works, I think government, frankly, just doesn't have a lot of the toolkit to be able to scale pilots and mainstream them. Have you seen any promising approaches about that, or any any examples of governments who've kind of done a good job of that, or approaches that you've taken, kind of the training methods that Apolitical takes to kind of help people to be able to kind of get over that pilotitis, as you call it?
So I can't draw any nice, I wish I could draw a nice direct line between the training and the benefits we're seeing from it, and an example of where that's been avoided. But certainly what we observe is one of the critical things you can do at the front end to avoid these projects being gummed up at the level of the pilot and getting no further is around, and it sounds so jargony, but stakeholder engagement. Because for
Hmm.
big systemic change in government, you need so many people on board, and you need them more than ever when things start to go wrong. And inevitably, any big ambitious project goes wrong at some point. So there's often this critical phase where the right engagement hasn't been done early, the right people haven't been asked, and then you get into any kind of trouble, and it becomes an albatross, something that no one wants to touch, and then it dies and gets dropped. So I think consulting people who might be affected even
Hmm.
tangentially early on is really critical. This comes back to silo busting, better networks, because you do that inherently. Um, building better pilots too. It's not just, I think some of pilotitis is a result of the wrong kind of pilots, where you don't think through the scale phases correctly. But this is a very hard systems problem with lots of
Absolutely.
complexity.
Well, as I often say, if this was an easy problem to solve, somebody would have solved it already, right? And I might just add to your list, which I agree with everything you just said, Robyn, is also the ability to shut down things that aren't working. I think that's the other challenge we often have in the public sector, is once something gets created, they tend to kind of linger, right? And we don't actually have good instincts to kind of say, you know what, this didn't work, and we're going to sunset it and kind of focus our efforts elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's a great aspect of digital culture, which should be infused well beyond anyone working on digital. And actually, that's one of the most exciting things we see right now about when we look at training around digital. So many of these digitally enabling cultural traits and skills and practices are so relevant to everything else in government. This ability to learn fast, cut your losses, um, be more flexible, be more collaborative. So there's definitely, I think, definitely a lot of transferability there.
Absolutely. So, Robyn, you're about 8 years into this journey with Apolitical, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's next and where you see Apolitical going next. And curious, number one, if anything has particularly kind of surprised you from the last 8 years. If you kind of were to think back as to what's worked or maybe what hasn't, and interested, what's kind of next as you carry your mission on. Is there anything kind of on the horizon that you're particularly excited about that Apolitical is going to be tackling in the months and years to come?
On surprises, one of the biggest ones has been how much culture, the culture of a global community matters to public servants, because you've got this interesting dynamic where governments are so different. They run differently, the country contexts are different, but the people attracted to the public service often share very similar principles and motivations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we've seen is just enormous valuing of that connectivity between different places. And where it came out most strongly, without naming a country name, one of a very large country that got a populist leader who was at the leadership level very against kind of collaboration, and there was a lot of nationalist talk and all the stuff we associate with populism. So we expected that government to, if anything, be much more disengaged from our work. And what we saw was the moment this person was elected, a huge surge in signups to Apolitical from this country. It's been sustained since. And we interviewed some of our new members, and what they told us was, we're so angry at the leadership, and we need to stay motivated during this period, connections to a global community of people who are like us, to connect us to what we stand for and what we think will ultimately emerge back in the country. So that's been really interesting. We've had some cracker quotes over the years to this point too, like a Canadian policymaker actually wrote to us and said, in an era of democratic recession, Apolitical is like Prozac for us depressed policymakers. So I love that one. I'll take it. I'll be the Prozac. Going forward, we are thinking a lot about scale, for one thing. We reached 200,000 people directly, many more indirectly, but that is just the beginning of the ginormous global public sector. So scale, how do we run our programs, our training programs, at a greater scale too? And how do we incorporate into them culture change and workforce transformation? So we've recently launched in this vein a program on digital excellence with the UK government initially, but we've engaged lots of governments, including the Canadian one, on inputting into the design. And the ambition of this is to train tens of thousands of public servants a year in the government on all aspects of digital and across levels, so from senior down to the more implementation level. And the early results are just incredibly exciting. There's a lot of enthusiasm around that. And that we've done in collaboration with the London School of Economics and EY in the UK, and the government being deeply involved in it. So we hope to do more work around that. I just want to call out climate specifically. It's one of our pillars, but we've recently leaned into this very strongly with something called the Government Climate Campus, which it has an ambition to train 50,000 public servants in the next 3 years on climate skills. So these are in core areas like decarbonization, but also adjacent areas, climate and mental health, climate and equity, etc. And that's Oxford University is one of our founding academic partners. The Bezos Earth Fund has backed that. So that's very exciting. Climate is something we all need to be working on.
Yeah.
And then just final note, going forward, leveraging technology, more AI, more to enable that scale ambition, and just to keep celebrating the fantastic people working in government and not to lose sight of all of that. A lot of what we do relies on product and technology, and we've got to get that right. But so much is also the human side. It's just recognition of brilliant people.
Yeah, I'm fond of saying, we often think about government as being this kind of, mechanistic type of organization, but it's actually made up of human beings, right? And culture change and transformation at its core, I think, has to be a human endeavor. And so very exciting about, the work that you're undertaking and where Apolitical is going. And, personally, I can say it's been a great contribution to the global movement around, government modernization. Robyn, as we kind of close off the conversation, and anything else that you want to bring up or kind of closing words to leave with the audience as we think about, how they can all, many of our listeners are public servants themselves, how they can kind of, personally be able to build up their skill knowledge and modernize their work as well.
Well, I just want to end on a note of gratitude, really. First of all, gratitude to any Canadian listeners, because as I said, you are part of one of the most inspiring parts of our membership, because you engage so much in what we're doing. So I would invite you to do that even more. We're launching new initiatives all the time. Some of them are paid, but a lot of them, as you'll know, are free. And we also very open. We always work community first. So if you see a gap, if you are, have a pain point in your organization and we really need to upskill in this, change the way we learn on this, we're always open to collaboratively designing things. We've worked a lot with Canadian organizations already. So thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your service. Thank you for keeping our team optimistic. It's why we have brilliant people joining Apolitical, because they're so inspired by the people we serve, who serve the public. And then just, I guess, a thanks to you, Ryan, and watch this space, because we are trying to find Apolitical and Think Digital are trying to find ways to collaborate. So hopefully we'll cook something cool up soon.
Absolutely, which I'm very excited about. And Robyn, for listeners who may not be part of Apolitical's network yet or on the platform, if they want to join the network and get in touch, are they best to do that through Apolitical's website?
Absolutely. So it's apolitical.co.co, and it is free for any public servant anywhere in the world to join at any time.
Wonderful. Robyn, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you.
So on today's episode, we asked the question, can we teach innovation? And is this a skill that public servants need to learn? I think the answer is a resounding yes. I wouldn't be in this business if I didn't think so. And I think one of the really interesting observations from Robyn is that individual public servants are, in many ways, more innovative and more risk-taking than the institutions that they serve. Certainly, I felt that when I was in government. And if we're going to tackle the big issues of our time, climate change, social and economic inequities, the crisis of confidence in democracy and our institutions in the public sphere, we've got to find a way to let the passionate people working in government unleash their potential. So what do you think? Reach out to us at letsthinkdigital.ca, use the hashtag letsthinkdigital on social media, or you can email us at podcast@thinkdigital.ca and let us know what you think about today's episode and the topics we discussed. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. And if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast app, be sure to give us a 5-star review afterwards. And remember, if you've liked what you've heard, please help spread the word. Let others know about this podcast who might be interested in it as well. Today's episode was produced by myself, Wayne Chu, Mel Han, and Aislinn Bournet. Thanks so much for listening, and let's keep thinking digitally.